Editor of the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And with me are reporters Anna Bryson and Dave Ress, and we're here to talk about the week in review in Virginia politics. So we'll start with a little bit of the state of play. We're about 4 weeks out from the end of the General Assembly session, and this week we started to see more of an indication about how we have a divided legislature. We saw how GOP curbs on abortion were defeated in a Democratic committee, and conversely, Democrats passed curbs on guns, and they were summarily defeated in a GOP subcommittee last night. So even with that said, we did see some things get accomplished this week. So I'm going to turn to each of my colleagues and talk about some of the significant things they saw in their beats this week. Dave, let's start off a little bit talking about where we stand with the governor's proposed tax cuts.
Well, that's a classic example of the divided government. The Senate Democrats and House Democrats have been very clear that Virginia has other needs than a $1 billion tax cut. Sally Hudson, a delegate from Charlottesville, for instance, was on the floor of the House saying, the tax cut would amount to $50 for a lot of folks. What's a kid supposed to do? Go into school and say, here's $50, teach me to read. On the other hand, the governor was also on the road this week. He spoke at the Jewish Community Center in the evening in something that felt like a campaign rally, and he spoke in a more measured kind of way to the National Federation of Independent Businesses. The same message. This is really important. This is about Virginia's ability to attract business, to grow, no one is convinced at this point. One thing that broke as well is on the tax question, probably the Democrats' top priority is something called a fully refundable earned income tax credit.
And this is something to help lower income families?
Right. It's let's not get into the weeds and how you appropriated for a credit against your taxes owed versus a check from the state. But the Democrats are very big on this. It was a top priority that they outlined early in the session. And Sia Price, a delegate from Newport News who carried it in the House, was defeated this time before a House Finance subcommittee. So that's sort of dead, but I am picking up some rumblings that will be, hopefully people can read about this weekend on possible movement here.
Another big priority for the governor is, and for Democrats as well, is trying to help the mental health system. We've had a lot of terrible, tragic shootings, and that's sort of accentuated that fixing behavioral health is a priority. Democrats have exceeded that is a priority, and they want to do even more, right?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. The governor really went more than I've seen any governor do recently. Very big on saying we need to spend more. We need to address crisis services, a particular gap in our services right now. And Democrats like that. But the sort of the Democratic leader on this issue, Senator Creigh Deeds from up in Bath County, has other ideas. And so he's proposing $162 million more than the governor wants. This would go to community services boards. Mm-hmm. And he's got some really interesting stuff on temporary detention orders, which are the 72-hour things where you can be held for treatment and for evaluation if you're in a real crisis. What's interesting is later this afternoon, Rob Bell, a Republican, is going to have the exact same bill before the Courts of Justice Committee. And so this is one of those areas where there may be some battling to go forward on the money side, but in terms of actually changing the law, there's a surprising amount of consensus, I think.
Interesting. Okay. Dave, you also had an interesting story about procurement and how there was sort of a change in how the governor's office wants to go about this.
Yeah, we had a story, I think back in the fall, about a very large $2 million contract with Boston Consulting Group to sort of rethink how we do procurement. And this raised a lot of generally quiet, but a little bit public sort of questions about, why are we having consultants do it? And we seem to be heading towards another centralization of state function. The consultant thing, I think, really kind of bugs people. And so in Senate Finance Subcommittee today, the Secretary of Administration revealed for the first time that the state has opted not to go with the second phase of the consultant's contract. That basically will keep the total bill down to about $1 million instead of $2 million plus. And the plus being that the consultant was to get a share of any savings. And instead they're going to go for a chief procurement officer and keep it all in-house.
Interesting. Anna, you've seen some significant movement on some of the bills that you've been following with education. Talk to us a little bit about what's going on with school choice.
School choice. So this week, a bill from Delegate Glenn Davis was advanced or sent to appropriations that would create education savings accounts, which are, they're not voucher programs, which a lot of Democrats like to call them because voucher programs have been deemed unconstitutional in a number of places. But how they differ is that instead of the state money going directly to a private school, it goes into a savings account for the parents. So basically it goes to the parents' savings account and then they can spend it on private school tuition, or if they're homeschooling, things like curriculum, pencils, things like that. But that one is not seeming very likely to make it in the Senate.
Yeah, this is another indication of the divided government where school choice is a priority for many Republicans. It made it out of a GOP-led committee on the House side. It could well make it through the full House, but it's probably a different story once it crosses over to the Democratically led state Senate. Mm-hmm. So you also wrote an interesting story about the idea of more transparency about what types of books are in school libraries and how localities should handle these situations.
Mm-hmm. It was an interesting time this week. Delegate Tim Anderson, Republican from Virginia Beach, on the House floor read from 6 different books that had sexual content in them that were available in some school libraries across the state.
Ann, you did notice how they sent all the pages out, right?
Yeah. Like I said, very interesting time this week. But he has a bill that would require librarians to mark any book that has sexual content in it. And then also, after the librarians marked those books, parents would have the option to request that their kids not be allowed to check those out. Those books are like gender queer, things of that nature that Tim Anderson has been focused on for a while, as you know. And then another bill would direct the State Department of Education to create policies for removing books from school libraries. The contention is that every school board in Virginia already has those policies, but despite that, that passed through the House this week.
And it's interesting that this is not an isolated incident in which 1 or 2 localities is talking about removing books. We've seen it everywhere from Madison County, where I believe one high school removed more than 20 books that they said included material that some folks found objectionable. And we've seen it, and there was a book that was up in Henrico County, and there was a vote this week on that, right?
Yeah, just this week. The book was called Monster, a young adult novel about a black teenager in Harlem who's on trial for murder. The parent who submitted that had talked about things that she didn't like about how race was discussed in that. There was also descriptions of sexual assault in the jail where the kid was, and also suicide ideation, which that parent took an issue with, but the Henrico School Board voted unanimously to keep the book, as they also did last year when 2 books were up for, were being challenged.
Interesting. So we'll keep an eye on that. And again, some of these GOP priorities probably won't make it on the Senate side, but these also could be fodder for the fall campaigns when all 140 seats are on the ballot. I wanted to mention a couple of other significant developments this week. Attorney General Jason Miyares came out with a rather scathing report about the parole board, the prior parole board from the Northam administration. Adrian Bennett, who's now a juvenile court judge down in Virginia Beach, was the head of the parole board in the spring of 2020. And the Attorney General says that, that Judge Bennett, then at the parole board, he asserts that she violated state law and violated a number of guidelines regarding release of people on parole. He says that her parole board released a number of people who had been convicted of murder, rape, robbery, and did not properly notify the victims of the crimes, did not properly notify prosecutors, and he even alleged that there was some violations regarding the documentation. Now, the Attorney General said that in his belief, she could have been charged with a misdemeanor for her handling of some of this paperwork, but he said that that's no longer possible because the statute of limitations has expired. For most misdemeanor charges in Virginia, they need to be brought within about a year of the alleged conduct. So we're looking to see what's going to continue to transpire here. Tommy Normant, who is the Senate Minority Leader from James City County, has called on Judge Bennett to resign from her judgeship down in Virginia Beach, saying that would keep the legislature from acting. He has sort of hinted that there could be impeachment proceedings. The question there, of course, is whether Democrats would go along with that. They've been sort of mum on this so far. One other interesting development I wanted to mention is that a poll came out today from the Wasson Center at Christopher Newport University. It said that a plurality believe that Governor Youngkin is doing a good job in his handling of the governorship, but a majority says that they would prefer that the governor not seek a Republican presidential nomination in 2024. 59% say they would prefer that he stay in Virginia and focus on his job here. Dave, there's been some speculation about a potential run by the governor for some time. What has he said of late when asked about this prospect?
Pretty much the same thing that he said all along. I'm focused on Virginia. The question comes up, I think, in almost every press gaggle with him. Maybe it feels a little less urgent now because you remember in the fall he was on the road a lot for campaigning for other Republican candidates for governorship in other states. He hasn't done that. I had an interesting thought that struck me. It's a question I want to ask him at some point. The rally at the Jewish Community Center about taxes was really kind of interesting because it was felt very, very political. Signs from the PAC, lots of cheering, all that sort of stuff. And then, you know, in addition to the little basketball game afterwards, you know, a lot of photos, a lot of handshaking, all that stuff. It made me think, you know, this guy came from a corporate world where you don't do that, and he really seems to love it. And I kind of wonder sometimes if part of why he seems to be running for president is just he likes doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah. He seemed to be in his element out there on the campaign trail where he was throwing basketballs at people. Of course, he was a basketball standout in high school and played at Rice. But one of the reasons that very few governors actually seek a presidential nomination while they're governor is that Virginia has this unusual statistic in which it's the only state in the country where governors are not allowed to serve consecutive terms. So the only governor in modern times who has sought a presidential nomination while serving was Doug Wilder in '92. And of course, that didn't last very long. And he subsequently said he thought it was his biggest mistake of his tenure. So stay tuned on that. Before we close out, I wanted to leave some time for what we might call the Seinfeld segment here. Some of the folks who are old enough to remember might recall Seinfeld, the TV show, was often called a show about nothing. They would do shows about sort of silly premises, and Seinfeld said, no one ever learns anything, there are no hugs, there are no lessons at the end. So with everything getting defeated on both sides, is this going to be a session about nothing, or are there going to be some opportunities where consensus might emerge. So Anna, what about on education? Where might we actually see some consensus?
Yeah, so one area is definitely reading and learning loss. The Virginia Literacy Act last year was passed unanimously through both chambers, and this year there's legislation that would expand that.
What would it do?
It would provide a lot of reading interventions for kids who are struggling to read. And so the legislation passed last year was for kids in kindergarten through third grade. The expansion this year is essentially widening that to include 4th through 8th grade from Carrie Coiner on the House side and then Luis Lucas on the Senate side. And that is definitely, I think, going to be moving forward.
Interesting. Dave, where do you see some signs for possible consensus?
They're kind of all over, actually. You know, the scope of what the legislature looks at and what the state government does is really quite wide. And so yesterday, I think it was, I was in the House Courts Subcommittee, and we had 2 bills, one from a very conservative Republican, Wendell Walker from out in Lynchburg, one from Angelina Williams-Graves from Norfolk. And these are about false calls to police. And, you know, who doesn't want to do something about the prank call that's got 20 cops responding to school? You lose a day in school, you got parents all stressed out.
Yeah.
And that, of course, sailed 5-zip out of the, what's really a gatekeeper committee, and it's probably on its track to, you know, basically one of those 100-zip kind of bills in the House, and presumably in the Senate, too. The fact that Delegate Rob Bell is introducing the exact same bill on a
Republican from Albemarle.
Republican from Albemarle as Cree Deeds, a Democrat from Bath County, on temporary detention orders is, I think, a sign that there may be disagreement about the money, but about what you do with people who are in a crisis, there's consensus, I think. A couple other sort of odd, you know, I got curious when you asked me about that, so I did a double check. We have things like Dawn Adams, a Democrat from Richmond, has had a bill. It's a little bill. We used to call a nice little bill, but not a camel's nose under the tent kind of bill, that says, you know, if your car gets towed and impounded, the towing operator can't keep you from going to the impound lot and getting your stuff out of the car. You know, sometimes getting the car out of the impound lot is quite costly, but you know, you should be able to get your stuff. And it also includes some caps on fees. 100-0 out of the House. Jeffrey Campbell, a conservative Republican from Marion, had a bill that says if someone driving while drunk kills a parent or legal guardian of a child, that driver should be liable for child support. Again, that wasn't quite unanimous, but you know, most Democrats voted for that. All Republicans did.
So, and to circle back on taxes, the fact that the governor's bills, even though they got sent back to a Senate subcommittee, they remain alive. So I was thinking this week about Dickie Cranwell, former Democratic majority leader, who said the best legislation is a little stew. So do you think we might see a stew on taxes by the end?
We will almost certainly see a stew. It will almost certainly come out of a conference committee. It will almost certainly involve Senate negotiators saying they didn't get everything they want, House negotiators saying they didn't get everything they want, although there will be, in that lovely old phrase, peace in the valley.
One last possibility for consensus before we close out. You had an interesting story about a blue menace and how lawmakers are coming together to combat it. Why don't you tell folks about that?
That was fun. I used to cover the Chesapeake Bay quite a lot, and got to know both Delegate Keith Hodges and State Senator Richard Stewart. And they're very hot about something called a blue catfish, which is a big old thing that eats a lot of stuff, including...
Really big catfish.
Yeah, really big. They can get over 100 pounds. And they'll eat crabs, they'll eat clams, they'll eat striped bass, they'll eat every... Keith Hodges was saying, fishermen are telling him they cut them open and they see muskrats inside. So they're, in both of these senators' view, they're a real menace to the bay. Maybe
And these were introduced by the state to give sort of an additional quarry for anglers.
Right.
And it wound up being an apex predator that's caused a lot of problems. That was about 4 decades ago, but boy, what they wrought. So
I tell you what, I was a little worried about. I had what I thought was a clever headline about a blue menace that's not Democrats but a catfish. 2 Republican legislators said. I thought, guys like journalists can sometimes get too clever for their own good. So I was sort of worried that that these 2 legislators would say, "Oh my goodness, I've got all my Republican colleagues saying I don't understand the main threat." And so I checked in with Hodges today, and he said, "Oh no, man, everything is funny. It's a great thing."
So maybe we'll have peace in the valley after all.
Perhaps
so,
we shall.
We'll keep on top of what's happening for the next 4 weeks, and I want to thank Anna Bryson and Dave Ress for joining me, and we encourage all of you to continue to follow our coverage on richmond.com and in the Richmond Times-Dispatch.